during wartime to see that. So I don't think it's a particularly Latin American, but I think what does affect it is a certain kind of certain kind of environment which is encouraging. For instance, dictatorships, obviously, where you're sort of eliminating the opposition as quickly as possible. That is something that sort of encourages violence. When that violence becomes extreme and extremely cruel, that is another question, you know. And I tried to sort of answer that question in my book. But I don't think that this is kind of different from certain violences in the past. The difference is that it's like free enterprise violence instead of state violence. And I mean, the narcos are really acting as if they were a state, I think. And since it's a sort of fairly totalitarian organization, the narco cartel, then they can, you know, wreak any kind of havoc. The other thing too, though, that's important to mention is that the use of bodies as messages. That was the case with the women in Juarez. They were used as messages, and the bodies were mutilated in particular ways. Now, the interesting thing about that is that that comes right from Colombia and from la violencia in Colombia. In Colombia, that's exactly what happened. The bodies were used in different ways, like an informer would have the tongue taken out and so on. Now, that's passed into narco culture in Mexico. And in particularly, I mean, it's a very propagandistic kind of culture when you come to think of it. I mean, they have the narcomantas in the towns, and bodies are put in certain places to make a statement. Some of them are beheaded, and heads are put in different places. So, you know, this is obviously something, I think, that came down the narco route from Colombia into Mexico and was imitated by the cartels there.
But I was thinking about that because, I don't know, sometimes I feel that cultural expressions of like machismo,
yeah,
it's very linked with narco culture and the expression of this extreme violence. Something that I don't think it would happen in other cultures where maybe machismo and the solution of problems through violence happen. I don't know, like.
I don't know about that. I'd like to think about it. I think the expressions are different. I mean, obviously, you know, in some places, I mean, they're not free to sort of go around beheading people and committing atrocities on bodies, right? But on the other hand, I think there are definitely. I mean, what tends to happen in a place like England, where I must say there's quite a lot of domestic cruelty. I think it gets sort of taken. It gets into the sort of like crime, local crime figures, right? In which domestic violence is the only outlet for these people. Well, if you think of it, in other situations, when you don't need to have domestic violence, or you may have domestic violence, but you've also got this kind of group violence as well. So, you know, I think in England, where it would be impossible to do what the narcos do in Mexico, nevertheless, there's a considerable number of bloody murders, like on an individual, you know, by individuals. Some of them are quite spectacular, by the way. Yeah.
I see something like a tension of the one side. You spoke about something very new, like dialectic between postmodernism and feudalism. But of the other side is, well, always the same. The whole substitution of politics by the pyramid, the authoritarian pyramid. Yes.
Well, also the structure, I think, too, of the narco state. I mean, it's completely totalitarian, with the capo and going right down to the people who do the kids, because it's also done by age, right? So it's the little kids who are doing the dealing, the young kids of 13 and 14. So there's a sort of hierarchical structure there.
This is very clear in I think a very good novel by Villalobos, Juan Pablo Villalobos,
right.
Fiesta en la Madriguera,
Yeah.
where this a young boy that describe all the situation, and the situation in the house of the mafia cartel,
Right, the cartel,
is
right.
like a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Could I rejoin a little with this image, which I of the cartels as a totalitarian structure, and also an underlayer of a feudal structure that you get
Yeah.
from Yudi's book and the like. I wonder, do you think that this is, how deeply do you think this is connected with the sealing of the border? That is, because the feudal structure that you describe and that is there in Yudi's book is around a certain kind of enclosure,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
in feudalism,
Yeah.
that is not exactly the plaza, as you well put it. The
Uh-huh.
plaza seems to be more of an open space
Yeah.
in which you control commercially, perhaps, and that you also try to control as a space of communication.
Right.
But it's not the actual
Like, yeah.
feudo.
No, it isn't.
The feudo is some other kind of space or place. And I wonder whether you think that this tendency for enclosure is connected directly to the closing off of the border, or whether you see this as a part of an older history of narco trafficking, because the closure of the border really only happened in the 90s.
Well, the odd thing to me is that the drugs get over the border.
Yeah.
People don't.
Mhm.
But, I mean, it's notorious that the drugs do pass over the border. Although now they're having a different route. Some of them are having a different route. They're going through Puerto Rico and across the ocean, right? But it's still quite certain that.
But
yeah.
the closure of the border is completely right. It's not a full closure.
No.
But what it does is create a structure, let's say, of thresholds.
Yes.
That certain points that you must go through.
Right.
Either they're official points, checkpoints, or they're like these narcotuneles,
Right.
or points of. But those getting through a threshold does involve a higher level of organization
Oh, absolutely.
than getting through a porous border.
Right.
No question about that.
Right.
So,
Well, not only that, but I mean the illegals who cross the border, so-called illegals, I should say, who cross the border. I mean, they pay a huge amount of money to get across, right? And I have a list somewhere of all the kind of people involved: the juntadores, the buscadores, who take the pollos right across the border. It's a tremendous operation, that, and the narcos control a lot of that now, especially on the west side on the east side, yeah, on the east side of the border, right? Yeah.
But if that's the case, then sorry, just to continue on this, the critique between, let's say, the Yepes versus Garcia Canclini kind of thing could also be really signaling a historical shift. I mean, Garcia Canclini did his study in the 80s, before the closure of the border.
Yeah.
And so it's possible that the drug culture in that period wasn't as feudalistic.
Oh, what an interesting argument. Yeah, it's quite possible.
Because certainly
Yeah,
people
they wouldn't need that kind of organization. Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
So the totalitarianism is, to some extent, a production of the...
Right. Wow, that's great. Can we have some drink or something like that? Yeah, sorry, you got to say.
Yeah, but it was just something that you can wait to your drink and to afterwards.
Just as you wish.
Do a final question, maybe one or two final questions, and then we have a reception here where we can continue with drink.
No,
and food,
I was
actually.
just going to say that I was very happy to listen to the medievalist that you used to be. Making sense of all those medieval.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but kind of. the Middle Ages was a long time ago as well, and it's still here.
I'm not that old.
But I was interested also. Perhaps there is a third novel by Yuri Herrera.
Yeah.
His three novels are based on some sort of medieval organization
Right.
in a certain way. The third one is based on a particular one that specifically deals with one of the problems that you are addressing in your book and in your talk today and in some of your projects, which is the figure of the alfaqueque. The alfaqueque, who is the medieval officer who was in charge of rescuing bodies from the other side of the border. I was wondering, do you think, just as perhaps a stupid question probably, do you think that real cruelty and violence has to be medieval in order to be really violent? So only medieval violence.
Are you claiming this for you because you're medieval?
I'm not claiming it. I'm trying to understand to what extent the self-representation of some of the narco organizations as medieval organizations, as medieval devotions, as medieval structures, etc., are to a certain degree a claim on violence.
Yeah, a claim on violence. What do you mean by that?
That they actually want to make a point about what real violence, extreme cruelty means.
Yeah.
That they are, in a certain way, so that's becoming medieval in a certain way, in order to be ostensibly violent and in order to be able to actually behave in the most cruel or understandably cruel possible way.
That may be too sophisticated an argument for what happens. It may be, I just don't know. Because I think a lot of these, well, I mean, I think if you think of the atrocities during the war, and for instance in Peru or in Guatemala, where there was a definite command structure and people had to obey that, right? And I think that's very similar to the structure of narco-violence too. Some people have to be the death dealers, right? Otherwise it's worse for them, they'll be killed. So, I mean, that is it's very crude, but that's it, I think.
Well, please join me in thanking Jean, and we have, as always, reception. Which I hope you enjoy, because we've never had a delegation before. We have actually a delegation in Colegio Michoacán, which is a huge honor for us, and also what in Casablanca famously was labeled the start of a beautiful friendship. We have this as a first event in what we expect will be an ongoing and continuing relationship between our institutions. But the reason for this event was actually preceded the idea of creating an institutional connection between Colombia and El Colegio Michoacán, and that was simply the sense of bewilderment, actually, that some of us have had with regard to what it is that's happening in Michoacán and how difficult it is to comprehend. I would say, on a personal note, as someone who writes for the press in Mexico regularly, and therefore as someone who reads the press regularly, that reading the papers isn't always that helpful if you don't really have the right kinds of questions and the right kinds of framings, both historical and sociological, with which to read it. The news is constant and quite bewildering, particularly from the past year or so, where autodefensas have taken towns that were supposed to be in the hands of either different cartels, which are sometimes templarios or the familia michoacana, and so it's very hard to keep track of all of it. But it's also kind of hard to visualize what it is that's going on. The level of the news barrage is actually itself kind of bewildering. And so in a conversation with some of our colleagues that you're going to meet briefly today, the idea that we had was to bring together some of the research that's been done, some of the researchers who've been doing research in Michoacán for decades now. Michoacán was founded already about 30 years ago, I guess. 35 years ago in